Okay, now let's look at some examples of component diagram. First example is order processing system. In this order processing system, there is a storefront component, an order processor component, customer service component, analytics component, and the shipping component. First of all, the storefront component provides the order interface and the product detail interface, and the customer service component requires the product detail interface in order to know about different product information and tell it to its customers whenever customer asks them about any product. And the customer service component also provides an order interface and the order override interface. So the customer service might need to manually order something for a customer, or they might have to override a certain order for a customer based on their requirement. So that's why it's providing both of these required interfaces. Both of these interfaces, these are being provided. The order processor component basically requires all of this in order to process the order. So anything order related needs to be processed by the order processor component. So it requires all the order related interfaces. And finally, by processing this order, it is providing the shipping related information to the shipping component, and the customer data related information or the customer data to the analytics component. And finally, the analytics component requires both of this in order to actually the analytics and the shipping component requires this in order to function properly. Next, we have an example of a nested component structure. Over here, this is also a store component which has which has nested components within itself. So if we look at the store component as a whole, the store component requires order entry from an external component and also the account related information from another component. So inside the store component, this order entry is required because inside the store component we have a order component, and for this all component requires an order entry in order to actually place an order. Again, it also requires the customer detail from the customer component, which when the order component places an order, it obviously needs the customer details in order to bind that order to that customer. And this customer component, in order to provide that customer details to order component, it also requires the account related information from some external component, which is required by the store component as a whole. And finally, the order component requires the detail of the orderable item from the product component. So the product component actually provides the orderable item interfaces in order to provide the data to the order component. So that's how this whole component actually works as a whole. Next, we have another example. Over here, there are three main components: the web store, the warehouse, and the accounting. So, our three main subsystem, if we say the web store, warehouse, and accounting subsystems. In the web store subsystem, there are three components: search engine, shopping cart, and authentication. In the warehouse subsystem, there is an inventory component, and the accounting subsystem, there is the orders component and the customers component. So first of all, in the web store allows product search, online shopping, registration, and login. So these are all the provided interfaces so that all these functionalities can be implemented by other components. So whenever there is a product search, the internal component search engine actually handles the search related functionality. The shopping cart component handles the shopping related functionality. So whenever someone places anything in the cart, this component receives that information or processes that. And the login and registration is handled by the authentication component. So whenever a search engine has a product search functionality, in order to implement that, it needs to be able to search in the inventory. So there are multiple connections over here where the search engine requires the search inventory functionality, and it is being provided by the inventory component. Again, the inventory component is also manipulated by the order component, because whenever an order is placed, the inventory needs to be updated. So it so that's why this order component requires this manage inventory functionality. And finally, when there is an order over here, the order is being the order is being processed in this shopping cart component. Then this order then moves to the accounting subsystem, and the order component handles that part, the order management part. And finally, it updates the inventory from here. And similar way, when there is a login or registration, the authentication component actually handles that part. And finally, these customers are being managed by the customer component in the accounting subsystem, and that's why there is a provided interface by the customer component, and the authentication requires that customer component in order to authenticate an user. Again, the authentication component provides a session detail to the shopping cart, because whenever there is a shopping cart or someone has carted a product, it needs to know which user has actually carted that product. So that session information is being provided by the authentication component from here. Now let's look at MVC architecture over here. So in a typical MVC architecture, there is a model, a view, and a controller. So model basically and manipulates the data, view renders the data, and the controller handles the interaction of the user, or all the underlying logics inside the system. So first of all, let us look at the first component over here, the UI component. From the UI component, we can track the user interaction. If someone submits a form, the component actually handles that. And so the model component and the control component is dependent on the data from this UI component. So it receives that data, and then they can actually perform the relevant operations within this component. So the controller component first receives this data, and then it requires the update average or the change settings functionality, or the update average and change settings interface. And this interface is available in the model component, because the model is actually the part which handles the data manipulation part. So whenever there is something where we need to create a data or update a data or read something, so all these functionalities are being provided by this model component. And the controller requires that in order to manipulate the whenever they in, whenever there is a trigger from the UI, the controller requires these update average or change settings interfaces in order to perform those operations. Also, it needs the create an update views option in order to update based on the UI, based on the interactions in the UI. So again, the view component also requires the information provided by the model component, so that the view can be updated based on that. So that's why the view requires the read settings. It needs to read various information from the model, and it needs to provide the create and update views option to the controller, so that the controller can handle the logic and create a view based on some logic or something like that. So this view component also requires the display uh, also requires the display and visualization routines, because the view needs to update the display based on all the information from here. So, and the display component is providing those functionality to the view component over here. So that's how the MVC pattern actually is works, and this is the component diagram for that. Now, if we look at the model component, there are multiple nested components within the model component itself, like the component which handles the data part, the component which handles the average part, and the component which handles the settings part. So whenever there is an update average operation, then this average component is being receives that data, and this data is again provided to the outer environment for the view to use this interface. Similarly, the data component also provides the read data option, and the settings component provides the read settings option to the view, so that the view can actually use this data to update the display. And and also for a create data option, the data component also provides a create data option create data interface, which is delegated to the outer environment through this port over here. And then this is how the whole model component actually provides the create data, update average, and the change settings operation to its external environment. So that is all. That covers some of the basic examples of component